Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's just about 1 o'clock. We still have a couple people filtering in, so we won't start just yet. But I've got Lindsay Heisler here from Seacrest, and she's going to say a few words to introduce us. So, yeah, Lindsay, whenever you're ready, if you want to take a minute, or if you're ready, go for it.
Yep, all set. Thanks so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you all taking out the time. I am Lindsay Heisler, as Will mentioned. I am the Business Development and Marketing Manager for Seacrest Services. We're very happy to be partnering with Will and the Association Reserves today to present you all a great course on the fundamentals of reserves. We hope you guys find the information very informative and useful, and we look forward to a great course with Will.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's 1 o'clock now, so we'll kick things off. I'm going to say hello to everybody here on camera for just a moment. I want to thank everyone for joining. Pleasure to be with you virtually Friday before Memorial Day weekend. I hope everybody has a great weekend ahead. So I'll say hello on camera just for a minute. I'm going to turn my camera off during the majority of the class just so everyone can focus on the slides for the course, which you should be seeing now. If you see a green and white backdrop that says fundamentals of reserves, you're in the right place. So Lindsay, thank you to you and your team for the opportunity. I think we met last fall at the CEO-MC trade show or something like that, as I recall, and started talking about this way back then, and now it's come to fruition. So it's great to come full circle there. For those of you who are new to this, if you've never taken the class before, I'll give you a quick overview. Today's class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. It's going to go for about an hour, maybe a little bit less than an hour, and then I'll stay on for hopefully at least 20 minutes or so of Q&A. Kind of depends how many questions we get. Usually we have a lot of questions that come in and usually not enough time to get through all of them. So I'll do my best to get through those. You can start whenever you're ready. If you want to use the Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar, go ahead and submit your question, and then I'll get through all those at the end of the class. Today's session is being recorded, so feel free to share that recording. I'll send out a follow-up email after today too with copies of the slides, links to the recording, and then we'll make sure to get everybody credit for the CEU credits for today. This is an insurance and financial management 1 hour credit. When you registered for the class, you should have had to enter your CAM license number, so we should already have that on file, but we'll take care of that probably within the next week or so. Quick reminder, or I guess mention, this has only happened once and hopefully won't happen today, but just in case we have any technical difficulties, if the power goes out in my building, if I lose internet, stay in the class. I will try to get back on as soon as I can. You know, like I said, that happened once before and it only was out for about a minute. So in the unlikely event that I freeze up or disappear, hang on for just a second. Hopefully I can come back in. Yeah, reminder, I guess, for all the CAMs today, this is 1 hour of IFM credit or as an elective, and those credits usually will post within about a week. So for now, I'm going to turn off my camera and then we will get started with the material. Okay, so I'll take just a moment to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. My name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008, and I've spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in Florida going back to the early 1990s. The RS, if you're wondering, after my name, stands for Reserve Specialist. That's the signature credential for people in our field who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with CAI, but we'll talk about them a little bit today. Personally speaking, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years as the treasurer of my own HOA in South Florida. Had a budget there of over $1 million. I think we had 635 homes in the neighborhood. And the reason that I point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? And I know what it's like to be a volunteer, to have that kind of thankless job and not to be the most popular guy in the community. So I salute you managers. If we have any board members on the line today, all of you guys who are out there, you know, working hard every day, trying to help these communities to manage themselves and to make better decisions. So that's me. Talk a little bit about our company. We are the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the US. We've been in business since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We have offices from coast to coast, and we actually have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, but other residential communities as well. We also have a great deal of experience with other property types. So things like office buildings, hotels, resort communities, golf courses, country clubs, worship facilities, so on and so forth. We've been very fortunate. For the last 9 years in a row, we've been recognized as a Reader's Choice Award winner with the Florida Community Association Journal. So we're pretty proud of that. One thing that I always point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we're not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, but we're this specialized consulting company which is focused on doing one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies, which help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So, if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help design for them, hopefully they're able to reduce the risks of special assessments and bank loans and all the other types of financial distress that can befall a community. So if you'd like any more background about us, you can visit our website. It's down there in the bottom right of your screen, reservestudy.com. I'll have my email address up on screen at the end, but if you want to write it down now, it's W Simons, so WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. Okay, we'll have a quick intro to a couple of slides, but the big overview for today is really just these two sections. Spend a little bit of time in the beginning, fairly basic question, what are reserves? And then spend the majority of the class talking about reserve studies and how these are used by community associations to effectively make sure they're on the right track, making sure they're paying attention to their long-term planning and budgeting. Okay, so again, feel free to take notes as you go along. This is all being recorded, so if I go over something kind of quickly, you'll be able to go back and watch that later on. And if you do have questions, feel free to submit those using the Q&A button whenever you like. Okay, 2 quick slides before we dive in. I put this one in pretty much every presentation that I give because I think this illustrates a very common reaction or mindset maybe when it comes to long-term planning. So what we see out there, what I'm sure you're familiar with in your communities, is this kind of reluctance to embrace this responsibility. And I think this guy here represents a pretty typical, pretty common attitude that we see when it comes to thinking about budgeting and thinking about reserves, right? So if you look at this guy, he's got eyes closed, fingers crossed, kind of this pained look on his face. And if there's anything that I want you to remember from today's class, it's that we all have a responsibility, right? We're all working with different communities, and we have a responsibility to educate these people and help them get over and around this kind of mindset, right? We're all the professionals in the field. We have to educate the people around us, not let them make excuses, and to help them to help themselves, really, to help serve their communities. And of course, as we all know, last summer, the tragic collapse of Champlain Tower South really put everything into a new perspective for us. 98 people lost their lives. I'm sure everybody saw the class action settlement recently, and I think it was $997 million being awarded to the victims. And this is just a complete shakeup of our whole industry. Absolutely terrible moment for everybody in this industry. But I think maybe an even greater tragedy if no lasting changes came as a result. If you've been following the news in the last couple of days, the governor just signed into law a new bill, which is going to change a lot of how community associations operate, including how they approach reserves, reserve studies, disclosures, inspections, milestone reports, all kinds of things. But just to connect the dots here, I mean, this tragedy really hit home for our company in particular because the building happened to be a client of ours, right? We had done the one and only reserve study in the history of Champlain Tower South. We did that in the spring of 2020, about 15 months before it collapsed. And, obviously there was, nothing we knew or could have predicted that would have told us this was going to happen at that point, but what we did know was that there were some major financial problems going on. What I've been telling people is that we knew this was a financial disaster long before it was a physical disaster. And that's another goal that I have today, is just to try to provide you some information. If there's anything we can do that would help other communities to help themselves financially and avoid any sort of decision making that might lead to a bad outcome. This is obviously a worst case scenario, something that we hope will never ever happen again. But reserves and how to take care of buildings is taken on a new light within the last year. So with that said, let's get into our first section. What are reserves? All right, so if you've been a manager for a while, if you've been in this field, a lot of this first part's going to be fairly elementary. But if you're newer to being a manager, if you're a volunteer, if you're just not used to working on the budget, let's talk about the two main aspects of any given community association's budget. So first of all, you've got your operating fund, right? And the operating money, we all know, is there for the routine costs of what I always call running the business of the community association, right? The daily, weekly, monthly expenses for things like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, so on and so forth. If you want to put this in different terms, kind of personal finance terms, you might think of the operating account sort of like a checking account for an individual, right? This is what you use to pay your grocery bill and pay your car payment and keep the lights on, right? Operating money is unrestricted, so that means that you can spend this money on any bill that the association has to pay. Typically, that money will be spent in the same year that it is collected. So what that means is that if you've designed a really good budget, there's hopefully not any significant surplus or deficit at the end of the year. You're basically spending all the money that you have within a fiscal year during that same year. Okay, on the other hand, of course, you've got reserve accounts or reserve funds. Now, these are there for the long-term expenses that associations have to pay for. So these things may not occur for, 5, 10, 25 years at a time, but when they do, these might be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay, right? So these are going to be used for things like roof replacements, painting, pavement resurfacing, elevators, lots of other projects we'll talk about going deeper into the class. Some of the other key differences here, reserve funds are restricted. So what that means is that once you put $1 into a reserve account, that can only be spent on specific things, not just any old bill that comes across the table. So another difference then is that in contrast to operating funds, reserve money does accumulate over time, sometimes over many, many years, right? You're building up an account balance until it needs to be spent on its intended purpose. So in that personal finance analogy, in this way, the reserve account functions more like a savings account would for an individual. All right, on this slide, I've got a short excerpt from Florida statutes, specifically Statute 718, the condo statute. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this, but what I've highlighted in red here, this is the portion of the text that talks about what associations must be reserving for. So if you look at that closely, the statute requires that condo associations reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they have this general definition. So the 3 particular things are roofs, painting, and paving. And then the general catch-all definition at the end is for any other item with a replacement cost greater than $10,000. Now, if you're wondering, why did they pick $10,000? That's a good question. I've been teaching this class for over a decade now, brought this up in front of lots of different audiences. And actually, nobody has ever given a clear answer as to why that number is 10,000 as opposed to 1,000 or 25,000, right? Nobody seems to know. My guess is that way back when they wrote the statute, they picked a number that sounded substantial and said, all right, let's go with that. But the point is that $10,000 threshold, that number is kind of arbitrary. And for many, many associations out there, that's probably much too high of a dollar threshold to set. Okay, so we'll talk about this a little later, but the more appropriate way to look at this is, what is a financially significant number to this association, to my association? This slide here, we've got a portion that of the statute 720 pertaining to HOAs, which actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in an HOA community. right? So unlike the condo statute, on the HOA side, there is no checklist. There's no specific listing of items that need to be included. Pretty much instead, all they say is that, there are certain things the association is responsible for. If you don't have reserves, then that might result in a special assessment. Okay. Now, the good news here is that there is a much more realistic, much more thorough way to go about defining what any type of association should be including in its reserve plan, which we'll talk about in a little while. For now, I just want you to keep this kind of basic definition in mind. Okay, reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Now, important to notice here what I did not say, okay? I didn't say, for example, that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements or paying your insurance deductible, or really, it shouldn't be used for any other purpose, right? So for example, let's say there's a community out there that does not have a playground now, but all the residents get together and they said, look, we really, really want to build a playground. That's a good idea. We've got tons of kids running around, and that might be a worthwhile thing to do, right? But they couldn't use reserve money for that. The reason is they're adding a new element to the association, which would have never been considered in any prior year's budgets, right? So any prior reserve contributions would not have taken that cost into account. So in reality, again, it might be a great thing to do, but the initial expense, right, the creation of that playground would have to come out of some other means, some other fund. Going forward, right, let's say they did it, they built the playground. Once it was in place, then they should start adding new components to their reserve schedule to start reserving for future long-term replacement cycles, right? For the equipment, the fencing, shade structures, fall surfaces and so on. But it's just that initial cost of creating something out of nothing that should not be treated as a reserve component. Okay, we're going to switch up now and get into the longer portion of the class, which are talking about reserve studies and how these are used by properties when they prepare their annual budgets. So first of all, let's just establish some terminology. Okay, the definition of a reserve study, something that comes from National Reserve Study Standards, which has been in place for over 20 years now. And they basically say a reserve study is a tool or a document that does a couple of important things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives you guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. All right, so notice again what I didn't say. A reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study. It's not an engineering report. It's a very particular document which contains very specific content regarding the physical and financial elements of the community. There are 3 types of reserve studies. Okay, so if you've never had one done before, then the first thing you're going to start with is called a full reserve study. So in that type, the provider is creating everything totally from scratch, right? Thorough site inspection and taking measurements, taking photos, otherwise, basically gathering up all of the data that will turn into the component list for that property. Now, after you've had a full study done, there are 2 types of updates you can do after that. The first type is called an update with site visit. So in that case, you've got a new site inspection taking place, but it's going to be based off of an existing component list. And the idea there is you're just looking for any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates based on current conditions at that property. Now, at this point, there are some states that require these types of updates at specific intervals. Generally speaking, the practice in the industry has been to consider an update with a site visit at least every 3 years or so. The new bill, that, by the way, that's just been adopted this week, talks about that being an every 10-year requirement. Now, I think when they wrote that, the intention was for that to be every 10 years that you have a structural evaluation done. But really more frequently than that is how often you should be doing a reserve study, because every 10 years is far too long between updates. There's quite a lot of things that can change from one year to the next. Now, the last type of update is called an update with no site visit, which is exactly what it sounds like. Okay, it still results in a whole new document, but now instead of conducting a site inspection, the provider is going to be corresponding with the board, talking with the property manager, to find out, what projects have taken place, what new information is now available since the last time somebody was on site, right? So it's still a whole new financial analysis and a total refresh of the data, just without the benefit of someone coming back to the property again. Okay, there are two parts to a reserve study, what we call the physical analysis and the financial analysis. All right. The first part, the physical analysis, this is where somebody will be coming out to do that on-site visual inspection of all the common areas of the property. So everything from the roof to the mechanical rooms, the amenities, the lobby, anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be evaluated. This is going to involve taking lots of measurements, lots of photos, but also documenting things like model numbers, serial numbers for equipment. Basically doing whatever else it takes to gather up the raw data related to each component, which will eventually be used to determine its life expectancy and its replacement cost. So when we do this physical analysis portion, it's usually very worthwhile, very helpful to meet with a representative from the property. And that could be board members, committee members, the manager, all of the above. But the big idea here is that we want to make this a collaborative process. We want to learn from the people who live there, who work there, and gain from their insights, their experience, their knowledge of what's working, what's not, what are some concerns the community might have. Make sure we incorporate that into the process. The second part of the reserve study is what we call the financial analysis. And this is everything that takes place back at the office, right? This is where we organize all the raw data that came from the inspection. When we start to analyze that data, we can research costs, project history, what has this property done in the past? How does that information compare with our experience working with similar properties? How do we start filling in gaps? How do we draw some financial conclusions and start putting them on the right path? Okay, so those are the two parts to a reserve study. The next thing we're going to talk about are the three outcomes. What do you actually get from this process? I'm going to go through these one at a time, but first and foremost, the reserve study has to contain a component list. And the word component in this context really just means some instance where the association is spending money, right? So a reserve component could be a roof replacement. It can be resurfacing the swimming pool. It can be remodeling the lobby. You get the idea. But for each component, there are three important pieces of information that we need to determine. So the first is the useful life of that component. Now, what we mean there is the overall lifespan, or in other words, how long is it going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or most recently replaced, until that will need to be done again. Okay, the second estimate is the remaining useful life. And that number will always be determined relative to a certain point in time. So for example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, but as of this year, it's only 3 years old. Okay, so in that case, you would say, again, as of this fiscal year, the remaining useful life should be about 7 years. Now, lastly, we'll come up with an estimate for replacement cost. And we've been asked over the years many times, do you have to be fully replacing something in order to spend reserve money on it? And to be clear, you don't. You don't always have to be buying something entirely new to justify that as a reserve component, right? Sometimes all you're doing is upgrading something or remodeling it, you're modernizing it, you're resurfacing it, right? And so don't get too hung up on the notion that it has to be a full-scale replacement, although quite often it is. The important thing to focus on is the need to spend money to keep that component providing its value to the association. All right, so if you're wondering now, how do we determine what goes into this process? How do you define a reserve component? This is the approach we're going to take. So I talked earlier about the Florida statutes and what they have to say with reserve budgeting. But I'm going to give you a different approach now. Okay, so those of us in the industry typically use this kind of 4-part test, which again comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Now, this is more of an open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be. And the beauty of this test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. Okay, so instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, instead we're going to go in with our eyes open, basically looking for anything on the property that might meet these criteria. So let's talk through these kind of one at a time. The first part, the first criteria of this test is that the component in question has to be that association's responsibility, right? An example of something that might fail this part of the test could be, the windows and the doors in a condo building. At least 99% of the time, the individual unit owners in a condo are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors, not the common area sections, but their own windows, sliding glass doors, and so on. So in those cases, we don't put any funding in the study for windows and doors at the units because that's not the association's responsibility. Second part of the test here is that the component has to have a limited useful life. So in our world, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there's really no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then that shouldn't be considered a reserve component, right? So an example of that might be the foundation of a building, right? The structural walls, the conduit inside the walls, anything that should last the life of the property, however long that is typically not something you're going to be funding for in reserves. At that point, if those things are failing, it's likely that the developer is going to need to come in and knock down the property and build something new than it would be that you're actually going to replace those things. Okay, the third part of this test is maybe the most complicated, which is that a component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be appropriate to include that in the reserve funding plan, okay? And the key word here is predictable. To be even more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency. Okay, so if the point is, if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll spend on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle that through reserves. Okay, so I'll give you a quick example. There's a lot of associations that ask us, can we list the insurance deductible we have as part of our reserve plan, right? It's a really big number. If we're ever forced to pay that, we would like to use reserve money for it. And the response is, well, in order for us to list that as a reserve component, we would have to assign it a useful life expectancy. In other words, we'd have to tell the client how often they would have to pay that deductible, which of course nobody knows. That's right. That's the whole reason that we have insurance in the first place. These expenses come as a surprise, whether it's a fire, a flood, some kind of natural disaster, a hurricane, of course. If you're making an arbitrary prediction about how often you'll have to pay your deductible, you're just guessing, right? You're getting away from responsible planning. Now, I want to make something clear. I'm not suggesting that you don't have any kind of plan in place. After all, it's Florida. There'll always be more hurricanes, more major storms coming our way. The problem is that we just don't know how often or how severe those might be. And so therefore, there's really no way for us or anybody else to tell a client how often they'll have to pay that deductible, right? In those cases, normally what we tell them is that, it's a good idea to maybe have a third account, right? You have your operating account for the routine expenses. You have your reserve account for the components that do meet this criteria. In addition to that, maybe it's a good idea to establish an emergency fund, right? Or maybe an emergency line of credit that's available to your community in the event that you do have to pay that deductible, right? So again, the problem with listing it as a reserve component is that when you do that, you have to base some funding calculations off of a specific timeline of expenses. And if we're containing some wild guesses there, right? If those expenses don't fall in line with our plan, then all those calculations would go out the window. Right? If we just assumed, for example, that we're going to give a useful life of 10 years to paying the insurance deductible, we're betting that there will be a major hurricane or something like that every 10 years. But let's say you get 3 storms in 5 years, and if you're expecting that your reserve account can absorb those costs every time, what's really more likely to happen is that you end up pulling money away from other things that do have a predictable lifespan. Which, there's, when you do that, now you're kind of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. It's more likely you're going to need some special assessments to make up the difference. All right, so the last criteria on this test here is whether or not the component represents a significant cost to this association. So I showed you earlier that statutory number, the $10,000 number, but again, remember that's somewhat arbitrary. For our experience, most associations should be thinking of a lower number. And the advantage to doing it that way is that, yes, now you're capturing more things that should be listed in your reserve schedule, But in turn, that takes the pressure off of your operating budget, which would otherwise be the only place that you could absorb those costs whenever they came along, right? So if you think about it this way, let's say there's some small association out there that has 6 projects, 6 components that cost $5,000 each. Okay, technically speaking, they would be okay. They'd be consistent with the statutes if they left those out of their reserve plan because, individually they cost less than $10,000. But let's just say there's, all 6 things happen to occur around the same time, right? If you do the math, that's a total of, around $30,000, which they're now forcing themselves to squeeze into the operating budget. And I'm sure you can imagine if cash flow is a little tight, maybe that puts them in a tough situation for that year. But on the other hand, if they had listed them in reserves, now they can spend those reserve funds on those things. Maybe that's less disruptive to the community. So the point is that there is no one dollar amount. There's no one cost threshold that is appropriate for any and all associations. Okay, just to give you some idea here, I drew this little red bracket at the top around the 3 components that are the only ones named specifically in the statute, right? But if you look down the list, I'm trying to give you some idea of the other types of things that you would routinely include in a reserve study. So you can look over that list there. I know the statute has that definition where they say, anything over 10 grand. But the problem we run into is that, there's a lot of associations out there that are not aware of just, how much things cost. So if I give you an idea, let's say there's a smaller, simpler townhome style community out there, maybe 15 or 20 components on the list. But if you're involved in a, big luxury high rise, a large HOA, any sort of big complicated property, it's pretty routine that we would have 50, 75, even 100 components, if not more. All right, let's now talk about this evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which is something that we express in terms of what's called percent funded. All right, now one of the best ways that we found to explain percent funded is to use the analogy of a credit score. Okay, now we've all had our credit reports pulled as individuals. You probably know what your score is or something close to it. You understand to an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, that score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. Right. So in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself, sort of like a credit report, and you have to distill that down to one key result, then that should be percent funded. Okay. Now we measure this on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything from 0 to 30% funded to be a weak position. What that means is that if you're in that range, associations have a much higher likelihood of special assessments and other types of cash flow problems. Now, once you get above 30% funded, now you're in more of a fair position, more of a moderate risk. It's not an emergency anymore, but where you really want to be is above 70% funded. Okay, that's where we've seen that there's the lowest statistical risk of these types of problems happening. Okay, we've now talked about percent funded conceptually. Let's talk about how you would actually calculate it. And the idea here is pretty simple. Basically, all you're doing is looking at how much money an association has at some point in time, and then comparing that amount against how much money they should have at the same point in time, which you can express as a percentage. Right, the first part of the test here, how much money do they have? That's pretty straightforward. Basically, we're going to look at the current financial statements and trying to look ahead to the start of the next fiscal year in order to figure out, how much money should they have going into that next year. Okay, the next step that we're going to do is compare that amount against how much money they should have. Right now, this notion, this concept of how much a community should have at a certain point in time is something we call the fully funded balance. Now, I want to make this clear, the fully funded balance, this is a theoretical number, but I can put this in perspective for you by posing it as a question. Okay, so if I told you that there's an association out there that has $50,000 in their reserves, but you don't know anything else about the community, is that meaningful? Can you take action with that? And you can't, right? Have I told you anything at all? Well, we hear this sort of thing all the time from board members, right? We'll get into a conversation and somebody says, we're in great shape. We have $900,000 in our reserves. And so we have to point out to them, look, 900 grand, that sure sounds like a lot of money, but nobody will really know if that's adequate unless we have something to compare it against. And you can see how that would take place, right? Depends on the type of property. If this is a little 2-story building with no amenities, just a parking lot, maybe that $50,000 is plenty of money for them. But if we're talking about a big luxury high rise, $50,000 is going to be gone pretty quick. That's a drop in the bucket. Now that might be one payment installment of one paint job for the building. All right, so we'll take this one step further and talk about how do we actually calculate this fully funded balance. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, what we're going to do, and we kind of do this on a line-by-line basis, right? We look at how old any given component is compared to its overall lifespan, which is going to give us a fraction. I'm then going to take that fraction, that life fraction, and multiply it by the cost of that component, which gives me a number. It'll tell me how much money should I have or should this community have today for its eventual replacement. Now, when you do a reserve study, it really doesn't matter. You can have 4 components or 400, but this is the approach. You calculate the fully funded balance for each line and then just add all those numbers together. That will give you the fully funded balance for the entire association. Once you do that, of course, now then you have something you can use to compare against their actual cash that they do have on hand and put that in perspective. All right, so we're going to do this as kind of an example together. Let's all pretend that we're on the board or you're managing this property that I'll call the Seaview condominiums. And the job is to calculate percent funded for this association as of the start of their fiscal year. Okay. Now, pardon the typo here, just pretend that says 2023. And, this is what we're doing right now for our clients. Here we are in 2022. We're looking ahead to typically to January 1st of next year, trying to figure out how much money they're going to have. So we're looking at financial statements. We're reviewing their current budget. How much money are they going to contribute to reserves? How much are they planning to spend? And where does that leave them going into the next year? All right, the next thing to do is to calculate the individual fully funded balance for each component, okay? Now, for the sake of this example, I'm just going to limit it to 3 things. And first, we'll look at the roof. Okay, let's say that our roof is 10 years old with a overall useful life, right, UL, useful life of 20 years. And let's say that the replacement cost of the roof is $80,000. Keep in mind, the fully funded balance, the FFB, is the proportion of that cost that you need to have on hand today. So if you think that the roof is halfway through its life, then really you should only need to have half of the replacement costs saved up today because you recognize you have another 10 years to collect the difference. So you would take 10 over 20, multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof right now is 40 grand, right? It's halfway through its life. You should have half of the replacement costs in the bank. All right, let's do another one. Same thing, but for gym equipment. Let's say that it's 5 years old with an overall life expectancy, useful life of 15 years and a replacement cost of 30 grand, right? If you do that math, the fully funded balance for this equipment should be 10,000. Again, it's a third of the way through its life. You only need a third of the replacement cost saved up at this point. If you do, you are fully funded with respect to this component at this point in time. Now, lastly, let's say you're talking about painting the hallways, right? You did that 2 years ago, and you want to do it every 8 years. 2 divided by 8, 1/4 or 25% of the cost, we all know, is going to be 25 grand. All right. So now that we've done the math, right? We know what our starting reserve balance is, and we have calculated the individual fully funded balances for each of those 3 components. We're now able to calculate percent funded for the entire association. It's going to look like this, right? We take that 40 grand for the roof, plus 10 for the gym equipment and 25,000 for painting. Add those together, you get a combined total of 75,000, right? That is the total fully funded balance for this community. If we looked at our balance sheet and they're expected to have 60,000 in the bank, 60 divided by 75 means they're 80% funded. Okay, not a bad place to be. So before we move on from this section, I want to talk about the importance of understanding percent funded and how we can draw some financial conclusions about associations using this as a metric. So what you're looking at on the chart here, this is the result of a huge internal analysis that we completed a number of years ago. In this case, we were looking at a data set, which was thousands of associations, and we wanted to compare two variables, right? First, what was percent funded on that 0 to 100% scale? Where did they fall? And second, yes or no, did we have to include any special assessments as part of their funding plans? And what you see is pretty obvious, right? The lower the percent funded level was, the weaker that community is, the higher the frequency of special assessments. And this actually even understates the risk a bit, because this only means that we recommended one right away. That's not to say that, if a community is 40% funded now, but they're not contributing enough to stay in front of their obligations, that 40% can slip to 30 to 20 to 10 very quickly. So the likelihood of a future special assessment is still quite high, even if you're in this mid-range position. Okay, another couple years later, we did another internal study, this time looking at the correlation between percent funded and property value. So this time again, looking at a big data set, basically greater Los Angeles, California. And this time what we tried to do was pick a group of properties that were as similar as they could be in terms of their size, their age, the amenities, so on and so forth. These are all comps of each other. We then looked at the market value of the homes, of the units in those properties, to see what difference does it make when a certain type of association is in a better financial position. Is there any increase we might see with respect to a community being in a stronger level of percent funded or not? So the first thing we did this time was to set this kind of baseline, right? If we're using weekly funded associations in that 0 to 30% range as our baseline, and then comparing, what happens when they're in a fair position, 30 to 70%, again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found was that the communities that were in a fair position tended to be about 8% more valuable than their counterparts in the weaker associations, measured dollars per square foot. Even more interesting, the associations that are in a strong position, 70%, almost a 13% gain over the weak communities, right? Now, why is that? Well, you can kind of intuitively figure that out. The associations that have money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal, right? They have better physical condition. That means they're more attractive to potential buyers, right? Maybe they have less turnover, more stable management, fewer renters, newer amenities, better technology, all the things that people care about when they're buying a unit. So, again, if you think of one of these, foundational questions, why is this stuff important? You can actually track a measurable gain in property value for having a healthy reserve fund. All right, so we're getting back to the main course here. We have maybe about another 5 or 6 slides, and then we'll go to Q&A. So if you have some questions, now's a great time to start popping those into the list, and we'll address those in about maybe 10 minutes or so. But let's talk about this third and final outcome that you get from a reserve study, which is, of course, the funding plan. If you think about the first two, okay, we talked about the component list. That's basically defining what you're reserving for. Next, we talked about percent funded. That tells us where the community stands as of a particular point in time. But then once you know those two things, there's one last question to answer, which is, where do we go from here? That's where your funding plan comes in. So the first thing that we do when we're designing this type of plan is to look at the current budget. What happens if this property just keeps doing what they're doing? Will that be enough, right? What happens given their future expenditures if they just stay on the track that they're on? And if it's clear that that existing plan is not going to be sufficient, well, then they have to make some changes, right? Two of the other points that I want to make here is that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of overall assessments. Okay, so if we have monthly dues payable to an association, there needs to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe that by law, that has to be made within 30 days. So in other words, what you cannot do is just operate throughout the year, hoping that at the end of the year, you have some surplus in your operating budget. You can drop that into reserves and say, hey, look, we pat yourselves on the back. We funded our reserves this year. Okay, it doesn't work that way. It actually has to be a proactive, ongoing plan. Now, the last point to make here is that in those fairly frequent cases where the historical contribution rate has not been sufficient, then it's oftentimes the association's in bad shape, and unfortunately there might need to be an immediate special assessment as part of that plan. When that happens, right, in those cases, it is appropriate to think of the special assessment as like a catch-up contribution that's going to be made to make up for all the years of prior insufficient funding. Okay, when we're designing a funding plan, there's a couple important things we want to consider. We'll talk about these individually. First and foremost, as you look to the future and you're modeling expenses over time, at the bare minimum, whatever you're putting into reserves needs to ensure that you have some cash left over, right? That's the bare minimum requirement. It's something we call baseline funding, because if you run out of money at any point in the future, you are guaranteed to have special assessments and loans. That's one of the main things we're trying to prevent in the first place. Okay, the contribution to reserves also needs to be stable. So what that means is, for example, you can't have huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time based on some arbitrary fluctuations. In other words, it's not fair to assume that some future group of owners will be perfectly willing and able to double the reserve contribution rate from one year to the next, because boy, wouldn't that make it nice on the people who live there now, right? You're not allowed to plug in balloon contributions. So for example, let's say you've got a $1 million roof replacement project happening in the future, but it's 10 years away. You cannot, here in the present day, put together a budget that shows that you're going to raise $950,000 in year 9, and in turn get away with putting away next to nothing between now and then, right? That's not allowable. You also don't get to take any years off, right? So for example, let's say you've just spent a huge amount of money modernizing your elevators, and you don't have to do that again for another 20 or 25 years. That actually does not mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization. It's going to happen again. You should begin funding for the next time around as early as possible, so that you spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time that you can, right? Now, the idea here is that the association members should be paying for the deterioration of components over the entire useful life of that component, not just all at once, right, when something fails. When you do it that way, everybody's paying their fair share, right? It's not just some unlucky group of people who happen to live in a property when everything breaks and they get stuck with the whole bill, right? I made this point to a client the other day. That's like, you're coming into a restaurant or a bar at last call, you just walked in the door, everybody else has been drinking all night, and they leave a tab for you and you pick up the tab for everybody else, right? This is not how reserve funding is supposed to work. Okay, now this is our last slide before we get into Q&A, but maybe one of the most important things to talk about here. So when you're thinking about reserves and your funding plan, this has to be fiscally responsible. And what do we mean by that? That means being realistic with respect to interest and inflation. Okay, it's just not realistic to assume that you can earn 10% interest each year on your reserve account. We know that reserve money can't be invested in anything very exciting, so that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. With respect to inflation, you should also be using realistic numbers there too, right? What we've found through historical data trends, again, last year or two being an outlier, is that over a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%, right? Now, if you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now is going to be the same as what it cost you today, you're likely to be way off. That plan's probably not going to work. All right, the second point on this slide here talks about being honest about the situation that you're in, okay? Now, this is very common, right? If your association has not historically done a good job of funding reserves, it's time to address that, right? It's just plain financially irresponsible to continue operating the way you always have just to maintain the status quo, right? It is not the job of the board of directors to make the owners happy, right? It's not the job of the board to keep the dues low compared to the building next door, right? Speaking of your owners, your reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. Again, don't think of them as just being willing to pick up the tab for you. This all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. Of course, we see this all the time. The prior budgets over the years didn't fund the reserves. The associations had the can kicked to them. That does not create an excuse to kick the can down the road for the next group, right? In a perfect world, and obviously this is not a perfect world, but if in theory, all associations would have been doing this well over the years, they should all be in a stable financial position, but that's almost never the case. That does not in any way remove the obligation from the board to act responsibly and to fulfill that fiduciary duty they have to the community, right? Listen, at the end of the day, we understand this is going to be a big challenge for most communities, right? If you've been operating for many, many years without funding properly, there's a very good chance your community is going to be in some kind of financial hole that's going to be hard to climb out of. But you have to just take stock and recognize that for what it is, right? The owners in the community deserve to make an informed decision. And having a reserve study done, going through this process, that's a very helpful way to make that possible. People need to know what the consequences are, right? If they don't fund the reserves, the only logical conclusion will be special assessments, loans, drops in property value, so on and so forth. So we'll bring it in for Q&A in just a moment, but just to tie it back to the beginning, remember the guy we saw in the first couple slides there, eyes closed, fingers crossed, hoping for the best, right? If you take away anything from the class today, please just remember that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible financial plan. So with that said, we will open it up for Q&A. Lindsay, if you're still with us, I don't know if you had any questions or anything that you wanted to say before we dive into that. I'm going to take a sip of water while you do that. Okay, all right. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now, and I'm just going to kind of start at the top. Before I answer any of these questions, let me just make a few points. First of all, I'm not an attorney, I'm not an accountant. So if any of these questions are kind of legal in nature or that I wouldn't have the answer to without doing a formal study or knowing more about the community, probably won't be able to address that. But I'm going to try as much as I can to give you, general information, general guidance here. So the first question up here is, how difficult is it to convert from line reserves, meaning straight line reserves, to pooled reserves? We've also heard that the state of Florida is considering prohibiting pooled reserves. Is that true? Very good questions. We're actually going to have another follow-up class, I believe, in a couple of weeks, which is going to be called Reserve Funding Methodologies, which is going to cover in its entirety the difference between straight line reserves, pooled reserves. But the short answer, if you have straight line now and you want to switch to pooled, basically there's a couple of ways you can go about that. One is you have to have typically a majority of a quorum of owners vote that they approve the pooling of reserves, that you're taking all those straight line accounts, putting them into one combined pool. In other words, it's not a board decision. The board cannot move existing funds from one place to another. However, what the board can do is say, from this point forward, like from this 2023 budget on, we are creating a pool and all the new money we collect is going to go into that pool of funds. It's only the moving of existing money into that pool that would need to be approved by the owners. Heard that the state of Florida is considering prohibiting pooled reserves. This is a developing story, okay? The bill that was just signed by the governor, I believe last night, contains a ton of information in it that, to be perfectly honest with you, we haven't had a chance to digest. I don't think the intention is to prohibit pooled reserves. That would be a very stupid thing to do. Pooled reserves are by far the preferred way to fund reserves. Outside of Florida, 49 other states, pooled reserves are basically universal. So if the government wanted to somehow prohibit that, I think that would be a major misstep. But I guess part of it's going to depend on how these new laws are interpreted. So to be determined there. Next question, and I'm going to try to mark these off as I go. New treasurer here. Last reserve study was done 4 years ago, pre-pandemic. When do you suggest a new one to be performed? I would say as soon as possible. Yeah, 4 years ago is a long time in our world, particularly the last 4 years. Costs have skyrocketed in a lot of categories. So, not actually, it kind of doesn't matter if you're a condo or HOA. I would say the economics of, community associations are very different than they were 4 years ago, let alone the fact that you might have done projects since then, which are maybe not now included in your reserve schedule or not updated. So yeah, if it's been 4 years, I would say it's time to do a new one. Okay. How do you estimate when doing the annual budget on a project to be done 12 or 20 years from now without having to add higher costs in the last few years? I'm not sure if I understand that very well, but if the question is about doing a project 12 years or 20 years from now, you definitely need to consider the effect of inflation. I mean, anytime we're doing a reserve study, we're going to present the current situation, right? What is the going rate to do this project, to do it now in today's prices? What is that going to cost? You should absolutely be modeling some future escalation to that to figure out what it will be. Now I see there's a follow-up to that question. You have no way of knowing what the cost will be in the future without having an assessment at the end of those years. How do you figure that? Yeah, we don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. There's no guarantees that things will cost what we think they will out in the future. That's why a reserve study needs to be updated. Hopefully along the way, whether it's annually or every couple of years, you would be getting closer and closer to reality, talking to those vendors who would do that project and getting the benefit of that, new information, right? If they tell you 3 years from now, the cost has gone up 15%, then you need to course correct. You need to now assume a higher number at that point, and probably an even higher number in the future, so that as you get closer to it, you're capturing, you're reducing the risk that you will need a special assessment to make up the difference, right? So think of this like college planning, right? I have a 4-year-old son, and we have a college fund for him. I have no idea what the cost of tuition is going to be, what is it, 14, 15 years from now. But I can look at historical trends. I can see the average tuition rate is going up by X% per year. So if I at least assume that will continue, I have some estimate of what it's going to be in the future. Between now and then, I will constantly be monitoring that and trying to make sure that our funding of that account gets closer and closer to reality. So it's, yeah, nobody has a crystal ball, especially to look that far out in the future. But if you do minor interim changes and adjustments along the way, then hopefully you can reduce the risk that way. Good question though. Okay, we have a reserve fund line item that is funded, but would fail the 4-part definition test. How does an HOA reallocate such funds to a more appropriate place? That's kind of a tricky one. I'd have to, I think, know a little bit more about what it is that was funded and why it fails the test. How would you reallocate such funds to something more appropriate? That's a good question, maybe for your accountant or your attorney. One example I can think of is we've had a few clients that were gated HOA neighborhoods with private roads that had been funding reserves for repaving of those roads and replacing those gates. And then at a certain point, they decide to remove the gates and make the roads public. So now they're maintained by the city or by the county. Well, they still have all this road reserve money and gate reserve money that they had set aside. I think at that point, they would just need to, decide what's the next most important thing on the list, or if it's pooled reserves, that just stays in the pool of funds and is available for everything else that they do have still. It's a good question there, but something that might need more background to properly answer. Do you recommend many reserve accounts or one pooled account? I would say definitely pooled. Just no question about it. In our experience, pooling reserves is very advantageous. A couple of reasons for that. It's an easier administrative process to fund those reserves, to spend that money. But maybe most importantly, it's a lower total cost to the owners to do that, right? If you look at the same community, and we do this all the time, if they have straight line reserves now, we'll do a straight line funding calculation. But then we also show them this is what happens if you pool your reserves. And the act of pooling it makes for a more efficient distribution of all your available cash, and oftentimes results in a much lower contribution rate needed. So again, tune in for our future class, that reserve funding methodologies. I've also got that class recorded from other sessions. So if you want to get a preview on that, feel free to send me an email. Still got my email address up there on the screen. So feel free to reach out and I can send that to you if anybody who's interested. Okay, do financial calculations for funding take inflation into account? They absolutely should. There's a longer answer to this, which is that at the moment, there's a DBPR restriction that says a funding plan shall not include any balloon payments, meaning, I guess I should say the interpretation of that, unfortunately, at present is that any increase whatsoever going into reserves constitutes a balloon payment. So if I tell a client this year you need to contribute $100,000, next year increase that to 104 and then 107 and 112 and so on. The DBPR has told us as reserve study companies, you can't do that. You're increasing it from one year to the next. We consider that a balloon payment. So if you think of that for a moment, you're prohibiting the increase of cash going into reserves from one year to the next. By the same token, if you include inflation, meaning the costs of those components, those expenses is increasing over time, then in order to hit the same objectives, you would have to raise your contribution rate much, much higher. So in response to that, the only thing that makes sense is to temporarily take out inflation and tell the client, look, this is a 1-year recommendation. You need to update this next year, at which point you can raise your costs due to inflation. You can raise your contribution rate to keep up with that. But what we don't want to do is tell a client to do, the same thing for the next 10 years in a row and expect that that's going to work out. It just won't. So yeah, you should always ultimately take into account inflation from one year to the next. All right, good question there, Kathy. Okay, what do we do with money that was not used from the year's budget? Does it go into reserves, or could we use it for projects that we did not have a budget for? Yeah, so if you have a surplus of operating funds and you have a cushion of operating money that's at least, I don't know what the conventional wisdom is, 3-4 months worth of expenses. If you have more than that, then yeah, I would say reserves are a great place to deposit that money. That's, more often than not, reserves are underfunded, and I think that would be the best candidate. But you may consider some other capital improvements, right? Do you set aside that money, put it into an emergency fund, like I talked about for hurricane deductibles? That's another great idea to use that reserve money for, or that extra surplus money. Yes, the slides will be available. We're going to send out a follow-up email with a recording as well as all the PDF slides of everything I talked about today. So please feel free to share those far and wide. This is all public information. So please feel free to share that. Okay. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? There's a poll I'm going to launch. So I'm going to launch that now. If you guys can all help me out by starting to answer those questions. It's only 4 questions. I'll keep talking while you do that. Where do you keep reserves to get interest? Laddered CDs? Yeah, I think that laddering CDs is one approach. It really, unfortunately, reserve funds can't be invested in anything very exciting. So, yeah, you can't just throw this money into index funds or mutual funds. Laddered CDs, general savings accounts, T-bills, pretty boring stuff. General idea is that you can't put the principal at risk. So, you can't just go out and buy a Bitcoin with your reserve money. Technically, it's not illegal, but if a board does that and the funds lose value, then I think you're open to breach of fiduciary duty there. So, yeah, there's tons of association bankers out there that can help you out with different reserve, investment programs, things like that. But it's not sexy. It's not going to be a big return on any investment there. Okay, a couple of people asking the cost of a reserve study. Really depends, the number of factors, location of the property, number of units, number of amenities, just the physical size of the place, but even what time of year it is. Right now we're kind of getting into our busiest time of the year, but we also have like a slow season, which is typically the first quarter. So I'll just give you very, very round numbers. If I look at the fat part of the bell curve of where our costs lie, it's typically between, I would say it's increasing a bit now, but maybe between $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, something like that. If you've never had one done before, first time out, you're doing a full study that's as comprehensive as it gets, that's going to be more costly. The cost of those subsequent updates would be a fraction of that. So yeah, a reserve study should not be a $10, $20, $30,000 expense unless it's a massive community. It's usually, a fraction of a percent of the annual budget. On that note, if you do want to get a proposal from us, you can go to our website, reservestudy.com. Right up on the homepage in the upper right, there's a button that says request a proposal. If you submit your request there, typically we'll get those out within a week. So we'll give you a more specific number that way. Okay, I've only got 2 more, so I'm going to try to go through these and then we'll wrap up. Thank you, everybody. I think we've got almost everybody's filled out the poll, so thank you for that. Got a real life example here. A reserve study in 2018 estimated the cost to replace our 6 roofs would be $785,000. We just received the bids because we were doing the project this year. The roof replacement for 6 roofs is actually $1.9 million. Wow. Obviously a huge difference there. My questions would be, what are the bids apples to apples? Did something in the scope of work change? Are you switching from, shingle roofs to tile or metal roofs? Is it a different type of product, different material you're considering? Does that project include anything beyond just a normal roof replacement? Are there structural issues that needed to be addressed at the same time? If it's a pure apples to apples comparison, then that's obviously a pretty big departure. 2018 is, in our world, 4 years ago now, but I wouldn't say that costs should have gone up quite that much for the same thing. So certainly more to look into. Oh, thank you, John. He says everything is identical. Material costs tripled. Well, there you go. Probably not just material costs. Labor rates have increased. We're also in the middle of still kind of a building boom in Florida. So a lot of contractors, a lot of construction companies, they're focused on new construction as opposed to replacement of existing things. They're all very, very busy, and they can kind of charge, maybe a higher price than what they thought. But yeah, just the material costs alone tripling that's pretty dramatic there. Okay, and the last question, how can we educate homeowners of these things? Wow, and John even says the top bid was 3.1 million. Good grief. Nice time to be a roofer, I guess. That's crazy. How can we educate homeowners of these things? They think board members raise fees for no reason. Homeowners don't think inflation happens to an HOA. All right, well, the last part's just silly, right? HOAs are just one part of the economy like everybody else. Board members, you guys are facing a very difficult job out there. I think to try to educate homeowners, first of all, read, send them webinars. Companies like us put a lot of content out there that try to educate people. Remind them that when you live in a community association, right, you are members of a corporation together. You are business partners, and the decisions you make as a collective business will determine the outcome of your business. In this case, it's not a for-profit enterprise. It's a not-for-profit corporation. But think of your profit model being a gain in property value and maintaining a competitive place in the market, right? There's no such thing as a business out there that doesn't need to reinvest and plan for the future, whether that's hiring new people, expanding their offerings, building a new factory somewhere. This is the normal life cycle for any sort of corporation, right? As communities, as condos and HOAs, look, you're subject to competition, right? There's new properties, there's new buildings being built all the time. And if I'm a potential home buyer, I have lots of options on the table. I can go to a building down the street that's maybe a little bit newer and nicer with better amenities. I can move to a different part of the state, right, where there's, better cost of living. It's a competitive landscape. And so one way that communities need to remain competitive is to continually, reinvest in what they have and what they're doing, just so that they make sure that it remains a nice place to be and something that people want to live there. So, all right, with that, I think that was the last question. So yeah, here we are. I really appreciate everybody staying on the line. Thank you for all your poll responses. That's very helpful. Lindsay sent me a message to say we're looking forward to the next one in a couple of weeks. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Happy Memorial Day, and we'll hope to see you next time. All right. Thank you very much.